Hello, friends, and welcome to the April 7th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly podcast designed to help mainstream Texans of faith understand the legislative process and help you engage with the Texas Legislature. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and this week we're recording from the University of Houston downtown at the invitation of the Center for Critical Race Studies. I'm excited for the conversation with Dr. Stacey Floyd-Thomas. Dr. Floyd-Thomas is an author and the Associate Professor of Ethics and Society at Vanderbilt University Divinity School. She also serves as co-founder of the Society for the Study of Race, Ethnicity and Religion, and as the Executive Director for both the Society of Christian Ethics and the nationally acclaimed Black Religious Scholars Group. Her focus on the intersection of ethics, feminist and womanist studies, critical race theory, and more provides an important lens for Texans of faith given the issues the Texas Legislature is currently considering. We expect these issues will continue to demand attention post-legislative session and into the next election cycle. But before we get to the conversation with Dr. Floyd-Thomas, I want to acknowledge the hard work advocates have been doing this week at the Texas Capitol. There are too many bills moving this week for the pros to do it themselves. And democracy is a team project, and Texas Impact teams are doing incredible work. We are in the middle of committee season, and bills are moving on school vouchers, diversity, equity, and inclusion, deputizing lay people as law enforcement, all kinds of craziness. And you all are responding. So thank you. It is going to take all of us working together, both during the legislative session and beyond, to create the just and equitable communities our faith calls us to. And Texas Impact is here to resource your work. To find out how you can get involved or to sign up for our weekly newsletter or action alerts, go to texasimpact.org and click on the Action Center. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out at scott@texasimpact.org. So with that, I want to thank Dr. Vita Robertson and Dr. Jonathan Chisholm with the University of Houston Downtown Center for Critical Race Studies for organizing this conversation. And now, I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with Dr. Stacey Floyd-Thomas. We are excited to be recording today from the University of Houston Downtown Center for Critical Race Studies. And y'all, I am very excited about today's conversation because joining us today is Dr. Stacey Floyd-Thomas, who is serving as the 2023 Scholar in Residence and is making the rounds this week, certainly enjoying her time in Houston. Dr. Floyd-Thomas, welcome back to Texas. How are you enjoying your stay so far?
Oh, thank you, Scott. Well, they're saying that it's winter today just because it's a cool, 70 degrees outside.
I mean, I walked around outside and didn't sweat. So yeah, we're gonna call that winter in Texas.
I know that's right. Well, I'm from Corpus Christi, Texas, so I understand humidity and heat. It's good to be back home, so to speak.
It is, and I know they're keeping you busy this week, and I appreciate you taking the time. You're here kind of in a perfect week because a lot of the issues we're going to be talking about today are front and center in the Texas Legislature this week. But I want to start out with your areas of focus, which relate to Christian social ethics and particularly specializing when it comes to feminist and womanist studies and critical race theory, certainly issues we've heard a lot about in the news over the course of the last year or so. So for listeners who haven't spent as much time in academia, let's start with some grounding on both feminist and womanist studies and critical race theory. What are they and why are they important lenses to be considered when addressing public policy?
Well, I think many people are familiar with what feminism is as a movement that takes the equity of women seriously. And womanism is an extension beyond that in saying that all women are not the same. And so when we talk about issues of equality, we're talking about giving people opportunities, giving people access. Feminism started off as a movement in its first ways, really, since the time of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which was alongside the same time when Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass were also acting towards the abolitionist movement and the suffragist movement. But what we have seen over time in the three waves of feminism is that feminism has largely been a movement that has tended to the specificity of the realities as they impact white middle-class women for the most part.
Right.
So while we can talk about equality, we realize that people, for instance, like a Sojourner Truth, who worked tirelessly, who really was a hallmark leader for both in the Niagara movement, for both the suffragist movement and the abolitionist movement, they used their agency to change society for the good, but they did not necessarily reap the benefits of that change in their own lives.
Right.
And so womanism furthers the work of gender equity in saying that not everybody starts at the same playing field. Not everybody starts at the same level. So how do we level up so everyone can have equal access? So womanism then lends itself to the African-American experience, in particular, women who find themselves at the intersections of racism, sexism, and classist oppression. It's a term that Alice Walker originated in 1979, but had its popular reveal in 1983 in her prose text, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. And there she finds, as a woman who's been disgruntled by her experience within feminism, she says that she has to go back within her own culture to find a way to articulate not only the origins of her experience, but the objectives for her flourishing. And she says that to be a womanist is to be womanish, i.e. opposite of girlish or frivolous, to take oneself seriously. It stems from a saying between a mother and a daughter, where a mother is literally chiding at her daughter, correcting her, saying, "You're acting womanish, like you're grown." And so it's based on a Black woman who wants to take herself seriously, to be audacious, in charge, doing things and acting in a way that some people might consider is a little bit too serious, right? Wanting to know more than what is considered good for one to know. She goes on to the second part of the definition, and she says that womanists prefer Black women's culture, which is committed to the survival of an entire people, male and female, not separatists, except for health's sake. And this is really a key difference between womanism and feminism. For womanists, it is believed that one needs to actually be a part of that Black female experience, but is committed to the entire freedom of people, right? Whereas with feminism, anyone can be a feminist, but it is committed only to the agenda of women's empowerment in that situation. So they're complementary, but very distinctly different in that way. The third part of the definition Walker talks about is that it is this project of loving oneself regardless. Loving those attributes and virtues that other people might appropriate or even ridicule. She talks specifically, loves food, loves roundness, loves music, loves the spirit, loves the struggle, loves the folk, loves herself regardless. So it's a project of showing that there is virtue what other people in society might consider to be vice. And at the very end, she says, womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender, saying that there is a commitment to the same aims of feminism, but that just looking at institutional sexism isn't enough, because it's inextricably linked to institutional racism, to institutional classism, heterosexism, ableism, elitism, anti-Semitism, all the forms of social ills within our society that keep us from being the more perfect union that we're supposed to be. And so I am a part of a great generations of scholars who take what Alice Walker did confessionally in naming a term about herself into an academic movement.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and so the second piece of the work you're doing is around critical race theory and critical race studies. So how does that tie into this work on the feminist womanist end?
Well, it's that same intersectional analysis, and it's the intersectional analysis or intersectionality, to quote Kimberly Crenshaw, that is critical to understand how, in fact, we become a more perfect union. You and I seem like we're in the same generation. We're Generation Xers, right? So we grew up on that Schoolhouse Rock. We learned the preamble in song. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and ensure the rights of our liberty for ourselves and our posterity. Well, the question is, who are the people? You know, who's the we that we're talking about? Now, we were told that's the great American melting pot. We were told that in song and rhyme. I was taught in church at St. Matthew Missionary Baptist Church in Oasis County, looking over the harbor of the sparkling city by the sea called Corpus Christi, the body of Christ, until we had an oil spill.
Right.
And I was taught that, you know, Jesus loved all the little children. Red and yellow, black and white, they're all precious in His sight. And in fact, though, while you might sing these songs, while you might learn them, while you say that you're pledging allegiance to the United States of America, one nation, when you look at what's happening outside of the rhetoric and you take a stark look, that it doesn't seem, in fact, perhaps Jesus doesn't love all the little children.
Right.
Perhaps the we does not include you and me. And so that's what critical race theory is about. It is looking at history and context for how it is shaping our present reality. In 1619, the United States was a fledgling country, right? And it became a great world power, literally by the exploitation, hijacking, gentrification, genocide of people who lived here, who've been displaced, who've been disillusioned and have been disremembered. And I say disremembered in every aspect of that word. And so critical race theory, a movement that started more than 40 years ago, that takes its heart and its roots within legal studies, is this enterprise that is saying that we need to find out the ways in which policy has not been shaped just on platforms, but how it has been shaped by the exploitation of people, our lack of knowledge about that. And there are many great people who have done that, from the works of Kimberly Crenshaw, who we oftentimes talk about and know, but a great muse and mentor for me, God rest his soul, Derek Bell, and Richard Delgado, among others. And so a good example of when we're looking at why critical race theory is important. In the 1930s, government officials literally drew lines around areas deemed poor financial risks, often explicitly due to the racial composition of its inhabitants, right? Banks subsequently refused to offer mortgages to Black people in those areas. Now, today, those same patterns of discrimination live on through race-blind policies, like single-family zoning that prevents the building of affordable housing in advantaged majority white neighborhoods, and thus stymies racial desegregation efforts. Right. And so when the clapback and the attack on critical race theory is because if we know that truth, if we realize that the middle class, for instance, is a myth, that 80% of the American population is fighting for less than 10% of the pie, that means that we realize that the 1% and the 10% that own over 70% of American wealth, we get to see how that happens. Yeah. You know, why is it that we, during the subprime mortgage swindle and the 2008 collapse, right, economic collapse, that we bail out Wall Street and we forget those on Main Street every time? Critical race theory shows us the full context of the American story so we can undo what history has done.
Yeah, I want to come back to the policy piece in a second, but I appreciate that you grounded these principles, these theories in faith, in the gospel, right? And you are speaking to an audience right now that is primarily Texans of faith and many faith leaders, and you're certainly used to talking to those folks as a seminary professor. But I wonder if you can say a few words about how the church, how faith communities can do a better job of leading in these regards and in centering both women's voices and the voices of traditionally marginalized communities. What's your challenge to our listeners?
Well, I am a part of a Christian movement, a Christian form of identification that understands that there is no difference between Jesus and justice. To me, they're synonymous.
Right.
right? And so when people have the audacity to claim that church is not the place to talk about political issues. So I'm an ethicist, as you said before.
Right.
And people are oftentimes thinking, well, what is ethics? Is it the study of right and wrong? And we try to inform that a little bit, but ethics is really about why do people do what they do, right? And so where do we find most of our ethical guides in growing up? We find it from three great institutions. Starts in the family. Right? Gets formed in school, informed in school, but it becomes fortified in our faith communities. And so one of the things that we're taught is how to be politically correct, how to be polite in good company, Miss Manners, Emily Post, whatever you want to call it. And what are the things that you're not supposed to talk about?
Religion and politics, right?
Religion, politics, and money. Now, what runs the world that we live in?
Those same things.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we are raised, informed, and informed to major in the minor. Now, those of us who are people of faith, who are informed and are fortified by Abrahamic religions, for instance, whether we're talking about Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, Micah 6:8 has resonance, which says, what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. For those of us who are on the Christian side of the equation, we can go to Luke 4:18. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, right? To deliver the oppressed, to give sight to the blind, right? And only in so doing can you proclaim the Lord's favor, and that this year is the sign of the times is marked by that anointing. We're also told in Matthew 22:37 through 41 that we are called as Christians to trust and believe with the Lord with our mind, body, and soul, right? And to love our neighbors as ourselves. And upon these two laws, all other prophecies and all other laws hang on it. Now, I don't think you would get any Christians who actually read the Bible and don't say 2 Corinthians, right? But I don't think you would have any Christians who would challenge that. But how can you say you can't talk about the injustices that you face day in and day out within the realm of the church? Everything that Jesus did informed how we understand why we should do what we do. And people call Jesus on policy all the time. Right? Healing people on the Sabbath, right? Protecting a woman who had been caught in an adultery by being stoned by the state. And Jesus reinterpreted that as, what are we called to do but to love? When we learned our very first scriptures, it was Jesus wept and God is love.
Right.
And so those are inextricably linked to the major issues that we're taught to dumb down and numb up about within the public square. And so I don't know how someone could call themselves a Christian. I don't know how someone could say that they are part of the Abrahamic tradition that says that we are supposed to do justice and not be at the forefront of many of these movements. And I would say that, when people say, when we talk about walking humbly with the God, I would say as an ethicist, well, what God are you walking humbly with? And right now we understand that the elephant in the room, to quote the Chronicle of Higher Education, is the way in which we find that we have a GOP system that proclaims and applauds a laissez-faire kind of government. But all of a sudden, they want to micromanage every single aspect of people's lives.
Yeah. And so let's talk about that a little bit because one of those issues that we've had to face here in Texas, living in a post-Dobbs world, is how we respond to issues of reproductive health, especially living in a state where maternal health outcomes for especially Black women are, third world levels almost. So how should Texans of faith, how should people be responding to those issues?
Well, my thing is, and as an ethicist, it's important for me to survey the logics and commitment of people to meet them where they are, and not necessarily persuade them against their faith commitments, but make them live into their faith commitments. So, for instance, if we're talking about a group of people who consider themselves to be pro-life, my question is, when does being pro-life end for you? It's really interesting that the very same people who want to control people's right to choose, control women's wombs, give other people the right to police women, right? I mean, that's what we see in the post-Dobbs decision that overturns Roe versus Wade. That if I say that I'm going to go get an abortion, you're my friend, that automatically gives you the opportunity to police my behavior and my womb as a kind of citizen's arrest.
Yeah.
I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable and unconscionable, but the very same people who claim to be pro-life are people who do not realize, who support us having automatic weapons. And I'm from Nashville. You know what happened just last week in Nashville?
Yeah.
Covenant School is literally 1 mile away from my home.
Oh, wow, I'm sorry.
My daughter's school sits in between that school and my home, right? And an alum of that institution goes back to her school where she was taught about how to feel, what she could choose, who she is, and what it meant to be loved by God and what it meant to be out of God's will. Decided to take the lives of other people. It took her life. So why am I using this as an example? I'm using this as an example to say this is what is at the heart, I believe, of not only critical race theory, but also the way in which we're seeing what's happening in this post-Dobbs climate of ours. We care about controlling people's wombs, but we don't care about their health. So about a year ago, before the SCOTUS made its controversial Dobbs decision, the pro-life GOP U.S. Senator from Louisiana, Bill Cassidy, who also happens to be a medical doctor, said the rate at which women die during pregnancy or shortly after is not as bad as it seems. If you subtract the deaths of Black women, which apparently don't count.
Right.
In an interview with Politico, this is what Cassidy said, and I'm quoting him. About a third of our population is African American. African Americans have a higher incidence of maternal mortality. So if you correct our population for race, we're not as much as an outlier as it would otherwise appear. Now, I say that not to minimize the issue, but to focus the issue as to where it would be. For whatever reason, people of color have a higher incidence of maternal mortality, unquote. Now, asked how Roe versus Wade being overturned would affect maternal mortality rates, Cassidy missed the question by saying, quote, if we're using abortion to limit maternal deaths, that's kind of an odd way to approach the problem, he said. Now, that, of course, is deeply problematic, especially if you happen to be a Black woman and a mother possibly forced to make the worst choice in your life. And so-called leaders and lawmakers, whether we're talking about Cassidy or what's happening in Texas, are actually stripping away reproductive options. Now, as NBS News reported earlier in the month, research suggests that the bans and restrictions would have manifold effects on maternal health. For one, if more pregnant people can't get the abortions they seek, they shoulder the risk of the U.S. relatively high and rising rate of death from pregnancy. So my question there is, if women are being forced to give birth and not having the choice with regard to their quality of life, whether it's women who are in relationships of consent or women who have been victims of rape and assault. If all you're going to do is mandate that they give birth and not give them the prenatal care, not give them the support that they need by way of correlation, it is relegated by law that children have to go to school. Minors have to go to school, correct?
Right.
So if it's relegated by law that minors have to go to school, what does the law have to provide? Public education. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
So if we're going to relegate something, and we're saying that we are being consistent in our care, It has to be transparent in our policies and actions that back up what our professions are. And in my mind, this is really another way of exploiting, marginalizing, keeping certain people out of the workforce, keeping certain people tied to poverty and to home. It is backlash against women's rights, against civil rights, against human rights, but none of us are protected from it, right? Yeah. We can't assume that we're only harming, right? Or we're keeping hermetically sealed the group that we want to be away from, and to mandate that they'll never be our neighbor. Right. And if they're not our neighbor, we'll never have to take care of them.
I feel like there's a sermon in there on who is our neighbor, but we'll save that one for another day. You are here. We were talking before we started recording today at a really interesting time because the Texas Senate, as we're sitting here, we're recording on Thursday, is hearing bills related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as somebody who can talk quite a bit about critical race theory, I feel like we need to ask you about this one. My assumption is this is going to be something we're going to be talking about for the next year through legislative sessions, through Congress, and through the next campaign season. I feel like this is an issue that Texans of faith, that people of faith need to own because our Christian tradition, our ethic should be that we are lifting up these marginalized voices. So how do you wish faith communities would respond to DEI proposals, to this whole notion of attacking programs for trying to ensure equity and inclusion?
I think it's, again, what are our objectives and what are our aims? If we actually want to have the influence that the United States of America has had on the world stage, we have to realize that diversity is not deficiency. Within Scripture, it says where two or three are gathered, touchy and agreeing on one accord, there God is in the midst. When we were to look at the different groups that we rival against, I'm a university professor. If we went by merit alone, nothing else, if we just went by merit, do you know what the makeup of the university campus would be?
Well, it's not great now with DEI programs. So.
Well, it would actually be predominantly Chinese, Nigerian, and mostly female.
All right.
But we don't know that. And we don't know, but that is why you'll start realizing that there have been a lot of measures released around standards. Certain schools not requiring standardized tests like they did before, because the certain people who are mastering those standardized tests no longer reaffirm a Eurocentric, heteronormative, masculine form of embodiment. So when policy shifts, it's usually because power is shifting. But if what we are literally striving for is excellence, we'll realize that our excellence is in our diversity. Our excellence is not in our homogeneity. It's only when you have that difference that you're able to complete. And if the United States does not glean that, we're already falling. And when we're talking about states like Texas, and I love Texas. I mean, I'm a Navy brat. I was born in Corpus. I was Texas Girl State Governor. I was, I'm Barbara Jordan and Richards all day long.
Love it.
Right? But when I was in high school, Texas had a different standing on the national level with regards to education. Now Texas, Georgia, Louisiana, Tennessee are slipping in the national ranks. I wonder why that is. If we look at the demographics, the more we hold on to a prejudiced, discriminatory stance, the more we hold on as people of faith to a Bible to beat people with, or the buckle or lash of a strap that just literally holds the girth of our professions and not our actions, we disserve ourselves. We undermine the development of our country. So again, I think that it is not a discourse just for the government, just for the church, or just for the academy. But it is a conversation, which is why I'm so grateful for this podcast. There has to be more and more platforms where we show up as whole people, where we show up as people who not only revere one aspect of ourselves, but every aspect with our mind, body, and soul, and the people in the rooms, and the people who had built the rooms, and the people who clean the rooms that we're in.
So you're a professor and our folks love homework. What does it look like for us to do that? What do you wish listeners would do moving forward?
I think that's very important for those of us within our faith communities. While we have our sacred text in one hand, we need to have the newspaper, a book, and the tweets and chats and comments of our children in the other. Our children are watching us. This present generation of millennials and Generation Next or Generation Z or Alpha or whatever we're calling the next generations, they are the most religiously formed. They are the most academically informed. And they do not believe in any of our institutions. They have been prone to, and they have been victims of predatory nature of professors in the classroom, parents at home, and priests and preachers in the church. And they have left us. The cancel culture that our generation is reeling from, right, is because they have they feel like they have no foundation. So I think that it's very important. I think when the millennials talk about fighting the elephant in the room, they're talking about the baby boomers, and they just skip over us. They skip over Generation X. But we have failed them, right? Yeah. Because there's so many parts that we felt were implicit. We who are supposed to represent children of the dream, we who actually were either bused or had the opportunity to live out policy in different ways and see the promising aspects of that, did not teach the lessons to our children of who fought for those opportunities that they now enjoy as indulgences, right? So I think that we have to be careful to live in a web of mutuality rather than compartmentalize what matters to us. I think we need to let go of being politically correct and practice correct politics. I think we need to come to the dinner table. We need to come to the business table. We need to come to the communion table with all aspects of what matters most in tow with us. That should be sacramental. Talking about money, right? Yeah. Talking about politics. Talking about religion in real ways and how it shapes lives rather than cloaks us behind a pretense of being holier than thou.
As somebody who works at the intersection of faith and public policy, I can appreciate that homework assignment for today. I've got an eye on the clock. I know you have other obligations today, but any closing thoughts you'd like to leave for us before I give you a chance for shameless plugs?
No, I've just appreciated our time together. I just want people to remember that whenever there is an attack out of the blue against something, that we might become ethicists ourselves.
Yes.
And not just believe what people are saying and not just be in shock and awe about what's happening around us or how it is, but to ask ourselves, why do people do what they do? And in so doing, we might plunge the depths of our own hearts, minds, and souls and become the change that we seek in reaching out to other ones. So it can be a perfect difference in the world, and not only in the world, but realizing that in so doing, the lives we might be saving might very well be our own.
Amen. Well, that'll certainly preach. It's like you've done this before. So I do want to give you a chance. Where can folks learn more? What shameless plugs do you want to leave us with today?
Well, I've had the privilege and or obligation to publish 10 books, many articles. Anybody could go to Amazon and just put my name, Stacey Floyd-Thomas, in there. My work is at the intersections of race, class, and sexuality and gender. What I have been doing most recently is making sure that even my own commitments as an academic are attached to what is happening in the now. Academics usually have the opportunity to stay in ivy towers and write and tweak something for years and years on end. But I was privileged to write a book during COVID with colleagues of mine entitled Religion, Race, and COVID-19, Confronting White Supremacy in the Pandemic. And we talk about what does it mean in that context to be a church of faith when the church is closed? What does it mean when people's breath is being taken away not only by coronavirus, but when officers are praying on your neck rather than being like Colin Kaepernick and praying in protest. Another text I wrote that will tell you a little bit more about womanism is Walking Through the Valley, which is womanist exploration of one of the progenitors of womanism. And then another one, which is really good in talking about who that God is. What's the God that we really worship? Is it a God of the Bible, or is it a God that's serviceable to us? And that book is called The Altars Where We Worship: The Religious Significance of Popular Culture in America.
All right, so book club time coming.
Absolutely.
Friends, I hope you'll check all of those out. Dr. Stacey Floyd-Thomas, really appreciate the time today. I really appreciate this conversation. It has certainly been meaningful for me during this Holy Week. And I'd also like to thank the University of Houston Downtown Center for Critical Race Studies for having you and for inviting us into this space today. So thank you for that. Friends, we've got some work to do. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Scott.
I'd like to thank Dr. Floyd-Thomas for the conversation and the Center for Critical Race Studies for hosting us. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and that you'll share it with your friends in your network. We're at the convergence of holidays for many faith traditions. So for those who are celebrating, I hope your holiday observances are filled with peace and meaning. As we wrap up, make sure that you are subscribed to the podcast and are sharing it with your friends and congregations, and go to texasimpact.org for other ways you can get involved during the legislative session. While you're there, make sure that you and your congregation sign up to be members of Texas Impact to support this podcast and the work of Texas Impact year-round. We look forward to resourcing your advocacy, and I'm happy to try my best to answer your questions, so feel free to reach out at scott@texasimpact.org. And with that, I think it's time to close out this episode, so remember, the world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnett, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.